I'm Mary Harron. I'm the director and co-writer of American Psycho.
I'm Guinevere Turner, and I co-wrote the script for American Psycho with Mary Harron. And I'm also briefly in American Psycho as the character of Elizabeth. Often confused with the hooker who eats the other hooker's ass, but no, I'm actually the girl he went to college with. No, he didn't go to college with me. I'm the Sarah Lawrence girl who wants drugs. Who ends up making out with the hooker.
Hi, I'm Chris Hanley of Muse Productions and the producer of American Psycho.
I'm Ed Pressman, film producer.
My name's Nathan Lee. I'm a film critic for the New York Sun.
I am Gavin Smith, the editor of Film Comment.
I'm Gil Revel, a crime writer. I've always been interested in the extremes of human behavior.
I'm Morgan Intrican, the publisher of Grove Atlantic.
I'm Amy Taubin. I'm a writer and a critic.
I'm Sarah Elquist, singer of the band Loma Linda. Bret Easton Ellis's third novel, American Psycho, arrived in 1991, accompanied by a flurry of bad press, protests, and even death threats. Originally slated to be published by Simon & Schuster, the American Psycho novel was hastily dumped amid brewing controversy a month before it was set to appear in bookstores. It was subsequently bought by Random House, who published the book in its Vintage Contemporary series, where it quickly sold 250,000 copies.
It intrigued me because I had read the book a few years ago when it came out, and I had read it not having any idea of a film adaptation. If someone had asked me, wouldn't this make a great movie, I would have said you're out of your mind.
The 27-year-old author had already encountered controversy with his debut novel, Less Than Zero, which was published in 1985 while Ellis was still an undergrad at Bennington College.
I had worked with a writer named Joe McGinnis on a book that became Fatal Vision when I was an editor at Delacorte, and when in 1982 I moved as a young senior editor to Simon & Schuster, Joe called or wrote me that fall and said, I have the most extraordinary student writer that I've ever encountered, and he's a freshman. I usually allow juniors or seniors into my classes at Bennington. He was teaching at Bennington at the time. And he said, I really think you should meet this guy, and I think you should take a look at some of his work. And he sent me some pages that ultimately became Less Than Zero.
The novel's detached vision of the sordid decadence enjoyed by a group of Los Angeles teens prompted the first criticisms of Ellis.
And I first met Bret that Thanksgiving of, I think 1982. It was his freshman year at Bennington.
Not only was he frequently assumed to be like his characters, but he was chastised for his sense of irony and for his fascination with surface over depth. In short, for embodying the characteristics of a postmodern sensibility.
I remember when I read the pages that were, at that time, I'm not sure they had the name Less Than Zero, but of just being startled by what an original voice. And I was 26 or 27 at the time. He was 19 or 18 or 19.
Ellis and his contemporaries, Jay McInerney and Tama Janowitz, were subsequently dubbed the Brat Pack and members of the Blank Generation. The sense of disdain and suspicion in the designations had shrouded Ellis's career ever since.
Less Than Zero, of course, was published to great acclaim, and people saw it as a sort of startling, fresh, and original voice.
In 1987, 2 years later, Ellis published The Rules of Attraction. But the book, along with a poor film adaptation of Less Than Zero, failed to ignite much interest.
But they commissioned what was to be a third book, and that was the book that became American Psycho. And I remember in the years that Bret was working on that book, I knew that he was exploring some very difficult terrain in terms of what he was doing, because it was really taking a toll on him.
However, with American Psycho, Bret Easton Ellis was once again back in the center of the maelstrom.
I remember there was, some controversy, and a publisher dropped the book, and it was supposed to go in a hardcover, and it didn't, and then it came straight out in paperback.
Simon & Schuster decided not to go forward with the publication. At the time, I had started a little imprint called Morgan Intrican Books that was an imprint of Atlantic Monthly Press. I offered to publish the book and very much wanted to publish the book, But by this point, it had become enough of a sort of public hue and cry that there were intimations that the National Organization of Women were going to try to take a stand against it, possibly filing obscenity suits around the country.
Feminists were among the book's most ardent critics. The National Organization of Women threatened boycotts of bookstores that carried the novel, dubbing it a how-to manual on the torture and dismemberment of women.
There was huge scandal, already in America over it, and arrived, with all these, horrified protests. And I started reading it on the subway, and as soon as I read it, I was like, this reads like Evil and Noir. To me, it reminded me of Vile Bodies, which is this great, surreal kind of black comedy about the bright young things of the 20s. Again, the so high social comedy and satire of the rich.
And another feminist group established a hotline featuring readings of the book's more gruesome passages the day it was published.
You could talk to Binky Urban and Brett Moore about this, but they decided to publish with Vintage, with Sunny Mehta. And as disappointed as I was that I couldn't publish the book, I understood the decision because I had a very small, basically two-man operation at the time, and I probably wouldn't have been able to handle it, and I think also the book probably needed the imprimatur of Knopf Vintage and that kind of infrastructure to support the attacks on it.
Feminist Tara Baxter was arrested for trespassing after reading passages from the novel aloud in a B. Dalton bookstore. She proudly recounts later visiting San Francisco bookstores, where she poured blood on copies of American Psycho.
One of the sad things about that book is that a lot of people passed judgment on it without reading it.
Even Gloria Steinem voiced her concern, warning that Ellis would be responsible for women killed in the manner described in the book.
I remember reading various defenses of the book. I seem to remember there was one by Norman Mailer. I thought that the defenses of the attacks on the book were stupid, and I thought to a large extent the defenses on the book were stupid too.
Ellis was also skewered as a bad writer, with critics lampooning his supposed lack of talent and originality in reviews that were disingenuous at best.
I don't think the book is a very good book. I don't think it's a book that... I think it's a book that's kind of interesting maybe as a kind of artifact of a moment, but I think, as a work of literature, I really don't think people are going to be talking about it in 50 years' time.
What's very ironic now is that the book now seems to have almost become part of the canon of late 20th century literature. I heard, this is now 8 years ago, I heard that it was taught in a course at Yale on the subversive novel that started with maybe Tristram Shandy and then Madame Bovary and then Ulysses and I don't know what else in between, but ended with American Psycho. And I think rightfully so. I think that if you look back, I think that book has stood the test of time. And if you look at it, it makes a profound statement about our time and those times, that decade, the 80s.
However, as many subsequent critics have pointed out, the novel was widely misread, due in part to the fact that it embraced a thoroughly postmodern stance.
It fits into a whole kind of literature that is, transgressive, I think was a word that a critic, Michael Silverblatt in LA, I think once coined, or some other critic used, of grouping writers like Ballard and Burroughs and Saline, going back some, but then with more contemporary figures like Dennis Cooper, Will Self, Darcy Stanky, Dale Peck, some of those writers that are exploring the kind of extremes of human behavior.
Rather than boasting a new and unique literary genius, the book is a self-conscious pastiche of other vapid texts, from fashion and porn magazines to self-help books, made famous during the Me generation, to the often overly indulgent film, music, and food reviews that pass for literary writing.
The chapter on Huey, Lewis and the News, this sort of textual exegesis of it's. I mean, I was crying tears of laughter when I was reading that chapter. I mean, the extreme violence is almost like a comic book violence, almost like manga comic kind of violence.
This book had such a reputation as being this unreadable, extreme, sort of amoral, repellent work of fiction, and the book is much more extreme than the film, partly because it's much easier to write about these sort of things and let the imagination create them than to actually show them. American Psycho is a book like Naked Lunch where you can't actually film it. It's pretty impossible.
At some point I was just like, what the fuck is this guy's problem? That's what I said when I met Brett. I was like, what is your problem, dude? Why did you write this? He's like, I thought it was really a feminist book. Brett Ellis was genuinely hurt and surprised that his book got all this negative feminist attention because he really thought he was writing a feminist novel. And I think that Mary and I saw that in the book.
It's very clear that the heart of the book is a pretty liberal, classically liberal humanist heart. He's not saying these things are good, he's saying these things are bad. And I think that Brett fell victim to a lot of panic about representation, as if representing something is as bad as doing it or is endorsing it. And my feeling is, and I got flack for doing the film at all, of course.
I was aware of the book when it came out, but I didn't read it until the year of the LA riots. I was living in LA, watching television with people, rioting and stealing television sets, and the book hit a nerve in that environment, and that started a long, winding road to finally getting the film made.
I was in Cannes out at Hotel du Cap, and there was a discussion with a Christian Halsey Solomon, and he told me that Ed Pressman and Johnny Depp and a director named Stuart Gordon were interested in this book, American Psycho. I just opened it up and I started reading, and there's this hissing sound coming out of the brain, and it was like, wow, this is good. I'm in. And Johnny Depp actually was out in the bar area by the pool, and I met him a few minutes later.
I think the first director we talked to was Stuart Gordon.
The first director that we ever actually formally attached was David Cronenberg. And we'd sent it out to De Palma, and a lot of people, Rennie Harlan, they declined, although there'd been some honest interest. And Stuart Gordon was interested, and Johnny Depp loved Reanimator.
But he had an idea of doing the film in black and white, X-rated, and really sticking close to the book.
I called my wife, Roberta, who was back here, and said, boy, I just saw this great movie. I shot Andy Warhol, and Mary Herron did it, and I got that Warhol thing really well. I liked it. It's going to give us some competition, for the awards at Sundance. And then my wife said, wow, why doesn't she do American Psycho? And I go, oh, come on. I mean, there's no connection.
Went to Mary because she had done her movie I Shot Andy Warhol, which is arguably a sympathetic portrait of someone who's psychotic and shoots Andy Warhol.
And then I thought, wow, she did. I heard, and we discussed that she'd done some BBC or Channel 4 music documentaries, and I liked the. And then I discussed with Roberta, well, it might be an angle on it, because what if American Psycho was almost like a documentary of a period?
My first thought when they called me about American Psycho was, just enough time has passed from the 80s that you could actually make a film about them now. You could make a period film.
By 1992-93, when we obtained the book rights, we already referred back to that period, which was 87 through 89, maybe up to 1990, as a period piece.
It was a strategic move just to get a woman at the helm of the movie, simply because then that's where all the feminist backlash is going to be absorbed or directed, at any rate.
Met Mary Herron, who had a very clear idea of how to approach Brett's work as a film, which was very much in line with what Brett and I had been talking about. I'd gotten to know Brett, and I think the term we used for a filmmaker was cosmic irony. That was a term I think Brett had, and the epitome of that was Stanley Kubrick and Dr. Strangelove as a reference.
I was working with Mary Herron on a movie about Betty Page, and we were A, stuck, and B, broke, This was 96, whatever. And so Mary said, I'm really actually interested in doing this project. And I'm like, American, huh? I was just like, I was Betty who? And she said, read this book. And she's like, but I remember she's handing it to me like, but, keep an open mind, okay?
In adapting Ellis's novel into a screenplay, Mary Harron and Gwyn Turner faced a huge challenge. Not only did they need to cut the novel's 400 pages down to a form manageable in a 90-minute feature film, but they needed to find a way to convey the book's voice of flat irony, as well as the increasingly crazed raving inside Bateman's head.
The whole point of it is that it slides between genres very disconcertingly, and one of the most compelling things about it and disconcerting things about it is that it stays totally in the mode of brilliant social satire, social comedy, and then with no bridge will just plunge you straight into a scene of complete horror, right into the middle sometimes of a scene. The transitions in the book are very abrupt, and that was something that I was very taken with, and I wanted to mirror that in the film.
I think first and foremost, the movie and I guess the book are both works of satire, and I think satire is a very specific form. It has certain characteristics. If you go back to Swift, if you look at Evelyn Waugh, like the really great satirists, there are certain things that really are very apparent. First of all, characters aren't important. If you look at Gulliver's Travels, the character of Gulliver, he's pretty much a cipher, and depending on which section of the book you're in, his personality completely shifts according to what Swift wants him to do. So the idea of psychology, of personality, of some kind of essence of character is really kind of sort of beside the point in satire.
Yeah, it gets into this really kind of intuitive kinds of conversations where we have to agree what the essence of the book is, what we like about it, and then move from there. But it's hard. And I have to say, it really bums me out because you'll meet people, particularly people who don't work in movies, who'll be like, oh, it was a book first. Like you just copied it into script form.
When Gwyn and I started working on the script, I wasn't thinking about casting. I didn't have anybody in mind for Bateman. I mean, the only sort of role model that there is for Bateman that's in the book is he keeps talking about Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise is this running theme. And, Bateman lives in the same apartment building as Tom Cruise. There's a hilarious scene where he gets into the elevator with Tom Cruise, and he's so impressed, doesn't know what to say. He says, I loved you in Cocktail, which is like the stupidest thing anybody,
I think the film is really well cast. I think Christian Bale gives a great performance, and I think he should be really proud of what he did. I think I wouldn't want to change that, but I would also love to see a version of the movie that starred Tom Cruise. I think Tom Cruise is really not necessarily who I visualized when I read the book, but if I were casting the movie, that's who I would cast.
Well, the first Pat Bateman, as we've pointed out, was Johnny Depp, but he didn't make it. He was now we're like 6 years later, and 6.5 years later, and the first Pat Bateman for Mary was Billy Crudup.
There was a long casting process because a lot of young guys wanted to play that role or were intrigued by it. So, Gwyn and I ended up having lunch with lots of very handsome young actors. And there were people who were very good actors. But it was hard. Nothing was really right. One of the problems I had with a lot of the actors I was meeting was that they always wanted to discuss the role psychologically. They wanted to know who Bateman was. They wanted to find out what his motivation was. And they were approaching it, as young American actors tend to do, very much in methody, terms of psychological realism and finding the motion and finding the character. And when I met Christian, it was such a relief that suddenly we were talking the same language. Is that he saw it as I did, which was that the character was a construct, that there was a lot of comedy in the role, a lot of satire, and also the character was not a cool guy, that you could find the patheticness, and Christian just went for that like a magnet, the patheticness and the absurdity. He thought he saw something hilarious in it. At the same time, he wanted to really, go all the way with it and make it see it from that character's point of view.
Sometime after we had set the film up at Lionsgate, the idea of making an offer to Leonardo, this was right after Titanic had come out, was suggested, and I think we all went along with it because we thought it was unlikely to happen, and I think the offer was $10 or $12 million, which at the time was unprecedented.
I'm sure everyone has their own version of this story, but I got a phone call one day saying, are you sitting down? And one of the producers said they want to pay Leonardo DiCaprio $20 million to make this movie. But they still want to make the movie for $6 million, so it was going to be like a $26 million movie. I said, that is the stupidest idea I've ever heard. It's completely insane. And I, admired Leonardo DiCaprio very much as an actor, but I felt he was not right for the role. I was too young, too poetic. I just didn't seem. I had already cast Christian. I already said I wanted to cast Christian. I felt completely committed to him. I felt he was the person who could make this work.
Because the Titanic was blasting away, they decided, what the hell, we'll send the script over to Leonardo, just see what happens, but nothing's going to happen. We'll just move forward. And that was on a Friday, and I got all these phone calls, first from Mary Harron's agent at William Morris, and then from Mary Harron herself, like, what's going on? I don't, I'm the director. I mean, you can't just like offer the film to, any actors without my approval. That wasn't my vision or anything like that. And I said, listen, didn't have anything to do with it, Mary, but between you and me, there's no chance at all that DiCaprio's gonna jump into this movie. I mean, think about it. And they were like, all right.
But to everyone's surprise, Leonardo responded positively, and his father and others around him at first supported the idea.
So on Monday morning, Rick Yorn, his manager, calls up and said he's in. He wants to do this movie.
If you pay an actor $20 million to be in a $6 million movie, I mean, it's all about the actor and his stardom, and I felt very strongly that they would have to rewrite the script, and they would have to rewrite the movie, that the movie was just too dark and too crazy. You couldn't take the hero of Titanic, the idol of millions of 12-year-old girls, and have him play Patrick Bateman in the script in the movie that I intended. It just wasn't possible. They would have to try and rewrite it and make the character more likable, which I think is what they tried to do. So I didn't want to do it that way, and they didn't want me to anyway. I think once it became a project on that scale, I mean, it was whether I quit or was fired, but anyway, I left the project in a sort of mutual disagreement over casting.
And he actually agreed to do the film and to announce it in Cannes that May. That
night at the Leaving Las Vegas premiere, which I attended, everybody was, the news hit like that. I mean, it was, the biggest star in the world had just attached himself to the most onerous, decadent, cruelest, horrific literary property that the world had ever seen, there were bids from Japan for $16 million. There were bids from Berlusconi for $60 million for international, and it spun out of control.
That was a whole trip unto itself, just in terms of the frenzy. How to this day people are like, "Can you get a script to Leo?"
And I knew that Christian had it right, And Christian didn't want to make the character more likable. He knew what he wanted. It was what I wanted to do. He wanted Bateman to be absurd, ludicrous, pathetic monster. And no redeeming features and no psychological backstory. All those things, I was afraid, if you bring in a huge movie star, they're going to give it backstory, psychological, motivation, and it just wasn't what I wanted. So I have to say, most difficult thing that ever happened to me in my working life.
Placed Mary Harron in a bad spot because DiCaprio hadn't been given her name on the list, and he had strict approvals. But anyway, Lionsgate, everybody was smart, and they went pay or play with Mary basically anyway, just in case. And they could, they'd pay her off the movie if she didn't make it to the finish line.
And it was very rough, and I think a lot of people thought I was insane. But,
I think I suggested that, like, in all fairness, let's not play, with fire here. He could end up back with Mary, and we don't want her to walk now. I mean, pay, if you got all this money circling around the project, at least guarantee to pay her no matter what, so that she has to do the movie if you decide that she's, should be the director.
I felt like it wouldn't be my movie anyway, and it would just ruin it. The pressure on it would have destroyed it.
Went through a whole sequence of director approvals. Ultimately, it became Oliver Stone. We had readings, and DiCaprio, kept saying, but this isn't like the book. The ending's different. This I didn't get direct, but there was a reading where he made that comment, and Cameron Diaz read with DiCaprio. I mean, it was over at Oliver's office. And it was a big deal. Oliver wanted to do the movie, but DiCaprio went off, did the Danny Boyle movie.
A friend of mine said, I went to a WNBA game with Gloria Steinem, and Gloria Steinem said that she took Leo into her office and said, "You cannot play Patrick Bateman. You cannot, and you cannot do this movie because you just did Titanic, and your fan base is 13-year-old girls, and they're all going to be, it's just not going to be a good place to take them." And so, according to legend, that's why Leonardo DiCaprio didn't do the movie. But the funny thing to me was that when she told me that, I was like, wow, if you had told me when I was like 22 that Gloria Steinem was going to be personally crusading that something that I wrote didn't get made, I would have burst into tears.
We had to go out and make a movie, so that we paid Mary, we got Christian Bale, we cast it, and we went and made it.
And I think in the end, everyone came to agree with me on this. We all came back together on this, was that it was such a difficult project to make work. It had terrible baggage of already people up in arms over it. It was considered this dreadful misogynist. There was no more hated book of the 80s. But I felt that if we kept a very rigorous control of tone and really knew what we were doing, I felt I could make it work, but that it would not be a big blockbuster mainstream movie. It had to be like an art movie. It had to just be really careful with it.
The only thing is, I don't think the world really realizes how difficult it was to take a book that had been self-banned by 70% of the bookstores in the United States for no constitutional reason, just their opinion about the book, and taking that and attaching a female director who had a vision to make it work even for females, which the original intent of the book certainly included. It was a satire, and it was meant to shock and yet cause analysis of racism, and prejudice against women, homosexuals, and all kinds of prejudices. And were meant to be addressed by the book, and yet we were confronted with limitations everywhere along the way. And the studios and independent financiers of note that could finance a movie were afraid of it because of that. And a lot of people got together, the author, the director, all the producers, and all our various companies and distributors, and just saw it a different way. And ultimately, we broke the barriers. And I just don't think anybody knows that barriers that probably shouldn't have existed in the first place are so difficult to break. I mean, when you watch the movie, you don't see it. So maybe that's something they don't know.
At the School of Visual Arts, I teach an avant-garde film class, but I also teach 2 feminism in film classes, and one of them is devoted to women directors. And one year, about 5 years ago, a young woman student came up to me, and she had looked at my screening list, and she said, "Oh, I thought for sure you'd teach American Psycho. I only took the class because I wanted to see American Psycho, and I wanted to hear you explain it to me." And so I switched it onto my list, and it's an extremely provocative film to teach.
I do think you can see the film as a kind of an extreme comedy of manners, because so much of it is about social status and how people interact, and social one-upmanship and social anxiety, and a great deal of it is about these transactions that go on between businessmen or between men and women in a kind of rather elevated kind of social world that's sort of kind of removed from day-to-day reality.
American Psycho is one of those rare films that it's very slippery. It's hard to put your finger exactly on what it's trying to do. The humor can be very over the top. The horror can be very extreme. You're not sure if this is being satirical, if it's being sympathetic. You're not sure when you're in reality, when you're in hallucination. It's constantly slipping away from you. And it's a quality that's I think, very rare in film in general.
In a way, it's the introduction of that element, the kind of horror element, or the element of the sort of serial killer violence, into a kind of a genteel, polite world, where whatever the sort of underlying kind of sentiments people have towards each other, which, I think, again, are very true to Reaganism in that it's very cutthroat underneath. But that's something that's a real tradition in social satire, going back to Molière. I mean, there's always the kind of surface politeness and the surface kind of manners and grace, and underneath the kind of really kind of primal kind of human urges, which are usually sexual or usually sexual. But here we money, sex, they're kind of interchangeable, I guess, in a certain kind of way of looking at the 80s. Money was kind of the erotic object. It was the sort of source of eroticism in the 80s.
The film, in some ways, it reminds me a lot of are the work of Cronenberg. Videodrome, I think it has similarities to Crash, where there's a remove from the material, and you're part of the experience of watching the film is figuring out how you're going to relate to any particular scene. Are you going to laugh? Are you going to recoil? Is it talking about Patrick Bateman? Is it talking about you? What's the sort of authorial take on the material, and how do you relate to that? It's very slippery, and it's constantly kind of fluctuating throughout the film, I think, in ways that keep you on your toes, and you're constantly having to sort of readjust your expectations and your reaction to what you're seeing.
When American Psycho came out, it didn't seem all that relevant to the moment. I mean, it was about a past moment, the 80s. But you look at it today, and it is totally about today, because those masters of the universe are right back here. And the idea that you have a president who, just like Patrick Bateman, his father almost owns the company. And you have a president who must, on some level, and that's why he's so disgruntled, feel some kind of guilt, the kind of guilt that doesn't make you nicer, but makes you really into a murdering bastard, that you have all this and someone else doesn't.
I think you could make a case maybe that the Times have caught up with the movie. I think the movie was maybe a little bit ahead of the Times in terms of its sensibility and in terms of a certain kind of satiric edge and a certain kind of willingness to kind of go a little further.
This movie constantly implicates you as a viewer. I mean, I think Patrick Bateman is a very specific person in a very specific milieu, but he's also a kind of everyman. And although we don't all certainly live in the lifestyle he does, it's what he represents and what he's living in is a really kind of common cultural aspiration, to have that kind of money, to live that sort of glamorous life.
The book and the film were often defined as, books about a book and film about the 1980s. But, the 1980s did not invent greed, did not invent commodity fetishism, did not invent a society that is so obsessed with perfect surface.
It's equally true of American Psycho, that these movies are a way of dealing at certain moments in history with a realization that's breaking through that there is this enormous institutional violence going on in the society. But it's really hard to make movies about institutional violence or even talk about it or conceptualize it. And so it gets represented in the form of the serial killer, which on the one hand is metaphorically interesting, but kind of lets everyone off the hook. Because those guys, the Patrick Batemans, the masters of the universe, they don't kill by going out and becoming serial murderers. They kill by the way they manipulate money.
I mean, to me, a lot of what the book is about is taking certain impulses in American life, the obsession with perfect things, perfect surface, and the anxiety and rage and pain, that people experience because things aren't like that, and in a way, the whole character Bateman is someone who rips the surfaces are not enough. He rips, he wants to create perfect surfaces, and he rips them open in an effort to find something, I don't know, meaning or whatever, some feeling.
You live in New York all your life, like me. I live in Soho. You have this proximity to Wall Street, and also beginning in the 80s, it became a playground for people who worked on Wall Street. And so you have a lot of contact with people who consider themselves the masters of the universe. I mean, these are the guys who cut in front of you on the line at Dean and DeLuca, and I'm a very aggressive New York type. I mean, I fight for taxis. I don't let people cut in front of me in lines. And if you object, they'll say something like, "Oh, what a shame, but life isn't fair." Whereupon, my impulse is to deck them. And I know that their impulse is to plunge a knife into my heart. I mean, it is that rage that you sense when anyone, does anything to these guys that they don't like. There are a lot of Patrick Batemans. I mean, they don't all act on it. But that kind of rage, because they're so unsure about their entitlement.
At the end of the day, the crisis of masculinity is something that's kind of been going on for a century. I mean, it just is reinvented in different forms. I mean, it's certainly been going on since World War II. I mean, Norman Mailer, and what Norman Mailer was about is about dealing with the crisis of masculinity. It goes through the 60s into the 70s, as other movements emerge, like feminism and gay liberation, and it's basically a kind of something that always needs to be expressed in a culture, and at different times it finds it finds different ways of expressing itself. I'm not sure how it's expressing itself right now, but certainly in the 80s, it was expressing itself through the kind of conspicuous consumption and sort of the excesses of Wall Street.
I mean, it's so interesting to me. I've met guys, only men really, who say like, "Oh, you were in American Psycho? I think that movie's so cool. Man, I am Patrick Bateman." I'm like, wow, and you're a big dork. Because if you're going to say I am Patrick Bateman, then A, you didn't get the movie, because I don't think that was above and beyond the fact that he's a serial killer, he's not very cool, So that's just I'm always looking at them like, really? So are you saying you're a dork or a serial killer? Or both?
If people identify with him, or if people felt like that was my life, I was like, I was that guy, or I am that guy, that has less to do with the character, because I don't think there is a character there. There's just a lifestyle. There isn't actually a character. He's just a kind of an empty signifier without any kind of interiority.
I think one reason why we're fascinated by serial killers and why the whole cult of the serial killer came out of the 80s was that we're looking for a story. We're looking for a narrative with an actor. And with a serial killer, every murder tells a story, and he's constructing a beginning, middle, and end. And he's trying to present himself as this master of the universe, just like the masters of the universe down on Wall Street.
And they're anti-heroes. And I don't think Bateman is glamorous at all. I mean, he's, he looks fabulous. He has a perfect body, he has a perfect wardrobe, and a perfect apartment. But the film, I think, never envies him on any level and never asks the audience to envy him. He's definitely kept at a remove, whereas most other serial killers, there's an element of glamour, I think, to what they do. And this is a very unglamorous movie.
Well, part of the propensity of a serial killer is the urge to be caught, and that represents his third act, whether they're aware of it or not. If you string together murders like beads on a necklace, what you're doing is you're sort of hurtling towards this climax of justice, of retribution, of punishment. And I think that's their end goal, unconscious, conscious. This has been widely recognized in FBI profiling, that serial killers have this unconscious urge to come to terms with their own acts. And I think that's present in Wall Street too. There's a underlying sense of guilt and of the apocalypse, and the sense on Wall Street that I just want to get mine is the same sort of focus of the serial killer. I just want to get mine.
You know, there's a way in which Patrick Bateman is simply a character in a fable about consumerism in the 80s.
I think there's several scenes in the film when Patrick talks about there's no one here, there's nothing here. You know, I'm a void, I'm a shell. And that seems to me also the situation with Ripley, the talented Mr. Ripley in the Patricia Highsmith novels and in the movies. He's also a void, he's also empty. In the Highsmith, it seems more existential, whereas in this one it's related directly to, I think, capitalism and the culture that he lives in, and his void is a kind of manifestation or reaction to that.
I mean, that's what America's about. America doesn't supposedly have a class system, but it does, and the class system is based on money.
Direction society was going, it certainly hasn't stopped. It may well be more relevant today. But you could also say, oh, this is like, they're like courtiers at the, 17th century, Renaissance courts, obsessed with status and the way things look and vanity and ambition and, I don't know that it just belongs to this time and place.
Looking back at the publication of the novel in 1991 and the release of the film in 2000, it's hard not to be nostalgic for the controversies they inspired. Pornography. The abundant fascination with blood, murder, and mayhem, and especially sexual violence as it is enacted on the bodies of women, points to a culture of gendered brutality much bigger than American Psycho. At the time, in the 1980s, feminists themselves were split on how best to tackle the issue of pornography. The debate may be seen through the position of two key organizations. On one side, Women Against Pornography, founded in 1979 by Susan Brown Miller, argued against demeaning depictions of women, insisting that they encouraged continued violence against women. For this group, pornography refers to the billion-dollar industry of films, videos, and magazines displaying the female body for a male audience. Its source is patriarchal, and the material is seen as perpetuating the oppression of women and legitimizing the psychic and physical violence required for that oppression. On the other side, the group called Feminists Against Censorship Task Force, FACT, maintained a broader view of pornography, acknowledging that it may include sexual representations by and for women, and may serve a subversive function. FACT's members also insisted that censoring pornography involved the fact that traditional porn is not necessarily a cause of oppression, but rather a symptom of a much bigger issue. Opposing wholesale censorship, FACT argued for acknowledging a greater complexity surrounding the issue of sexual representation. In some ways, the split between these two groups was characteristic of a larger split in feminism in general. between practical feminists rooted in 1970s protests and the drive to attain equal rights, and a more theoretically inclined feminism situated in the academy and schooled in post-structuralist theories of power, Marxism, and psychoanalysis. Angela Carter's influential 1979 book, The Sadian Woman and the Ideology of Pornography, helped articulate the more complex position on pornography. Carter posits a distinction between pornography in general, which serves to diffuse the explosive potential of all sexuality, and the work of the moral pornographer, whose domain is the real world and the nature of social relations. The moral pornographer, Carter argues, has the power to critique existing culture and to incite resistance to it. Examining the work of the Marquis de Sade, Carter writes that he became a terrorist of the imagination, turning the unacknowledged truths of the encounters of sexuality into a cruel festival, at which women are the prime sacrificial victims when they are not the ritual murderesses themselves. De Sade, as well as French philosopher and pornographer Georges Bataille, depicts acts of horrendous violence and degradation, often against the female body. In style, the depiction of these acts is both excessive and repetitive. De Sade's descriptions often go on for pages in painstaking detail. Similarly, Bataille piles descriptions upon descriptions. This may shed some light on Ellis's tactic. Like de Sade and Bataille, he describes scenes of brutality in excessive detail, not for excitement or to help build the story, but to underscore a dull accumulation of facts. Indeed, Bataille wrote specifically to create a sense of excess that would exceed any utilitarian goals. His work was founded on the desire to outdo a capitalist economy seemingly able to consume everything, creating an excess of useless expenditure of energy that cannot be reabsorbed into an economy was Bataille's most radical act, and it occurs in his fiction as cumulative accounts of degradation or perverse sexuality toward no utilitarian end. Ellis works in a vein similar to Bataille. The descriptions of violence and murder in American Psycho are at once excessive and tedious. They continue the book's endless list-making, itemization, and name-checking, and rather than serving to titillate, are at once repulsive and boring. According to Julia Kristeva, the abject is often that which crosses back and forth across the body's borders, highlighting what is part of the body and what, in a manner prompting disgust, is not part of the body. Bodily waste, vomit, menstrual blood all pass across the body's boundaries and as such inspire revulsion. And horror is often centered here, at the site of horrific somatic boundary crossing. As film theorist Barbara Creed writes, the horror film attempts to bring about confrontation with the abject, the corpse, bodily wastes, the monstrous feminine, in order finally to eject the abject and redraw the boundaries between human and non-human. As a form of modern defilement, right, the horror film attempts to separate out the symbolic order from all that threatens its stability, particularly the mother and all that her universe signifies. And of course, the abject is tied to class. The working class body is more abject than the bourgeois body. And class is in turn tied to taste, which in turn refers to both a cultural practice defined by social rank and to a physical experience, one made literal by Patrick Bateman, whose taste is for brains topped with expensive mustard.